Welcome back to Money Talks. I'm Matthew Moore in Istanbul. Still ahead on the programme, it may not be a 12-ounce steak, but it's where we could all be getting our protein fix in the future, the distant future, I hope, the food fad that's creeping into our lives. Now, lately, every time we've mentioned Panama, it's been followed by papers and the country's murky offshore business. But today, we're back to not Panama hats, but the Panama Canal. It's considered one of the wonders of the modern world and is now even bigger thanks to a $5 billion expansion. The canal reopened on Sunday, and this Chinese container ship became the first to sail down the expanded waterways. The Canal Authority hopes it will be able to generate an extra $2 billion of revenue per year as soon as 2021. What exactly is the canal and why is it such a big deal? Now, it may seem an innocuous body of water, but the Panama Canal is an incredibly important trade route, or a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The canal made it possible for ships to travel from Europe and Africa to Asia without having to navigate south of the Americas, drastically cutting the time it took to travel from one continent to the other. But as Craig Kapitas reports, a waterway of this magnitude hasn't been the easiest to make.
The dream to dig a 77-kilometer trench across Panama began in 1534, but the decision to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans 3 centuries later turned into a construction nightmare. About 800,000 mostly French investors lost some $287 million, and 22,000 people lost their lives to the disease, accidents, and political violence as the waterway was carved through some of the thickest jungle on Earth. At the turn of the 20th century, U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt declared that the dream could no longer be deferred. Roosevelt sent in the shovels and poured the modern-day equivalent of $9 billion into the project. Finally, the canal opened for business in 1914 and has been the pride of Panama ever since. But the marvel was ill-suited to handle the sea traffic of globalization. There are now just too many ships, and their size would have been science fiction for any maritime architect or civil engineer back in the 19th century. So the canal's capacity had to be expanded, but the impact and cost of the project were astronomical. Panamanians were given the final say in a referendum in 2006.
This time, it won't be foreigners that will decide what Panama does with its canal. This time, it'll be up to us. It'll be us who decide if we want to expand the Panama Canal.
A resounding yes vote saw the $5.3 billion refurbishment kick off a year later. 2 new locks were built to make room for vessels carrying 12,600 containers, almost 3 times what's currently allowed. The canal's contribution to Panama's GDP is expected to grow from 4 to 30%. Though it still takes 8 to 10 hours to traverse the Panama Canal, the decision to refurbish and reinvest in the world's most famous waterway has created some 30,000 new jobs in Panama.
There have been a lot of sacrifices made by Panama to build this infrastructure, and we are giving them an opportunity to feel where all of that effort is going into.
The effort and sacrifice now faces some stiff competition. One of China's richest men wants to dethrone this waterway's title as the world's largest by building one through Nicaragua at an estimated cost of $50 billion and double the depth of the Panama Canal. It would accommodate extra large cargo ships that aren't yet in common use. But as violent protests disrupt construction there, similar to that experienced in Panama, it could take decades before it's completed.
And Craig is back in Paris now after his jaunt in Panama. Craig, thanks for joining us. I wanted to ask you about the earning power of this massive infrastructure project. Does it have the power to transform Panama's economy?
Yes, it does, but in the past few days, a number of problems have come up with the waterway. An investigation by the New York Times showed that there's been a lot of leakage in the concrete that has lined the locks. Also, they're running out of, the Panamanians are running out of the fresh water required to refill the canal. And finally, the Panama Canal Authority bought a flotilla of tugboats to bring the ships through these new locks. For some reason that no one can figure out, the tugboats have a real hard time going forward, so they're always in reverse, to the point when they came over from Spain, where they were built, they traversed the Atlantic in reverse.
All right, Craig. Well, we're going to be staying with Latin America. We're going to turn to Puerto Rico now, and has to repay a vast debt, bigger than its entire economy, in fact, by Friday. Now, it has no chance of doing that, and people are afraid of what happens next. Now, Money Talks' Charlotte Dubinsky is in Puerto Rico for us all week, and she begins her series of reports by explaining how the island racked up such a huge debt in the first place.
There's no shortage of cash here. Less than $20 a pop, another customer leaves satisfied. But this is no summer fate. It's a rally against the debt crisis that's strangling Puerto Rico.
I used to work as an administrative assistant for the Department of Education, but I was laid off along with 30,000 other people in 2009. The government thought that by firing employees, the fiscal situation would get better.
It didn't, and the island has now been in recession for a decade. The debt now stands at more than $72 billion. That's bigger than Puerto Rico's entire economy. To put it bluntly, quite simply, it doesn't have the money to pay the debt back. But how did the situation get so out of control? In the 1970s, the US government introduced a tax exemption known as Section 936. It allowed corporations which settled in Puerto Rico to send their profits back to the parent company on the continental US without paying federal taxes. It just didn't last.
What happened in 1995 was that the Congress, out of nowhere, they decided to remove these tax incentives without providing any alternative plan. So they actually dismantled the Puerto Rican economy. Government revenues were decreasing, so the government said, well, what I'm going to do? I don't have enough income to pay the debt that was issued, so what I'm going to do is to refinance that debt.
The debt was attractive to investors because it was triple exempt, subject to no federal, state nor municipality taxes. Year after year, they gobbled it up. And the debt grew until it could be repackaged no more, and Puerto Rico spilled its guts. Now it's being choked by the demands of debtors. But there are some who say much of it should be wiped clean.
Puerto Rico, there's a very huge issue as to whether the $72 billion in debt are in fact legal in nature. Puerto Rico's constitution has a provision that states that its budget must be balanced, and that provision has been interpreted in a way that prohibits the issuance of debt to balance the budget.
What is clear is the anger this crisis has generated towards both the government here and in the US. People are furious that their once growing economy has become little more than a car crash.
And Charlotte joins us live now. Charlotte, what happens at the end of this week when Puerto Rico can't pay its debts? Does anyone know what actually comes next?
Well, it's lawsuits, Matthew, and let's just rewind back a moment to know who owns that debt. It was bought by hedge funds and mutual funds. And why should we care about hedge funds and mutual funds? Well, that's because millions of people who are looking for nest eggs in the United States and here in Puerto Rico decided to invest in that debt, thinking it would be a good return for the future. So if Puerto Rico doesn't pay that debt, it means that those dividends don't get paid to the hedge funds and to the mutual funds, and that then doesn't get down to the people themselves, the individual people who invested in this. And this means that people may have to change their retirement plans, put it on hold for a couple of years if they don't get the money they're expecting, or if they're already pensioners, it means they may have to tighten their belt and therefore spend less money, which is bad for the economy. And what's happening now is that there are multiple lawsuits already being filed against Puerto Rico because they're saying Puerto Rico's government assured these bonds. It said that they were absolutely concrete, and what we found out now is they're not.
Charlotte Dubinsky in Puerto Rico, thank you for that. Now, the idea of eating insects may churn a lot of stomachs, but a startup in China aims to make it part of people's everyday diets. The duo behind the project say insects are a valuable source of protein and could help feed the world's growing population. Pak Yu has the story.
A device that could become commonplace in kitchens. This hive contains mealworms. They're the larvae of meal beetles and packed with more protein and vitamins than most other insects. The grubs in this machine are harvested and can be turned into a dish within minutes. A report by the UN found it's not only more sustainable to eat insects, but it can be a healthy alternative to get your protein. Living Farms was founded by Austrians Katharina Unger and Julia Kaisinger. It is the world's first household edible insect farm. The pair came to Shenzhen 3 years ago as part of an accelerator program with the aim of developing alternative sources of protein.
Current livestock production is pretty devastating. We're using a lot of resources to grow beef, pork, or chicken. We need a lot of water, a lot of energy. We pump a lot of pharmaceuticals also in large-scale production of meat.
Until recently, eating bugs has been more of a novelty in the West, but it's a market that's expected to grow to more than $70 billion by 2020. Living Farms raised $145,000 to produce its hives, which will be available to buy from November. Unger and Kaisinger hope the farm will spearhead the industry.
Insects can be grown on waste materials. They can be grown on small spaces with very little energy and very little water as well, which is very important.
Unger recommends adding roasted mealworms to salads, but convincing people to do so may prove a challenge.
It's very difficult to change food culture in general. It's much more difficult to change than any other actually habits. People are staying with their food habits that they have.
But it mightn't even come to that. The world's population is expected to hit 9 billion by 2050, and as an alternative food source, insects could well crawl their way onto our dinner tables. Pak Yu, TRT World, Hong Kong.
That story's going to bug me all day. Now, that's it for us at Money Talk. Stay with TRT World, all the news after this short break. Thanks for watching.